So we've had a post on one of my other videos to ask how do we tighten the clutch up. They've got a clutch pedal which is a bit long and only really engages at the bottom of the pedal push. So we're going to be looking a bit around how the clutch works, what's involved, and how you might try and adjust the clutch. We're going to take a look at the entire clutch assembly. So we have our clutch pedal here, which we can depress, and when we do, if we zoom in a little bit here, you can see that it pulls our clutch cable. Now our clutch cable runs through this enclosed section here where we have our we've left it in gear, where we have our gear stick, and it comes out underneath the car. So we're going to go around the back and have a look there. So we're now at the back of our car and we're going to move the engines out so we get a good view. And here is our clutch cable. So it comes through and attaches to this piece with a spring on it. Now it's really difficult to see this, so I'm going to try and zoom in and let's see if we can catch it. Oh, we had it there. So just at that point on the gearbox as well, there's a little kind of linkage hoop that the cable passes between, and it's really important A, that exists, but B, that it's really tight on the gearbox. So I'm going to try and show you where that clip sits on a gearbox. So we have here a gearbox kind of shell, which is where all the gears would be in let's see if I show you this section here, and our bell housing, which this hasn't got, would be on the front here. If you don't know what the bell housing is, this piece here, this big piece here, wide piece, is the bell housing. That's what connects to the engine. And if we turn this to the side, it hasn't actually got one on this, but the clip kind of slides in to this piece here and screws in there, and then the clutch cable feeds through the kind of bracket that sits on here. So it feeds through there and it needs to be in there. This needs to be tight on in order to make sure that the clutch cable's working properly. So now we're back with our clutch cable, and this part of the clutch cable is a thread, and here you have kind of, from memory, it's like a dome on the other side of this nut, and there is the dome nut, and then there's a smaller nut in front of it which is kind of a captive nut, which is locking, oh sorry about that, which is locking the dome nut in place. And in order to adjust and make sure that this cable is as tight as possible, we can break the smaller nut off of the bigger nut, we can wind the bigger nut into where we want it, and then tighten the small nut again against the big nut, and that should lock it into place. We also need to make sure we've got a spring which comes in one side here and also hooks onto our bell housing here, and that spring needs to be in good condition and tight. Now from an engagement point of view, we want this to be as tight as possible to pull the cable as tight as possible, but at the point where it engages this, I don't know what you call it, this arm, but not actually kind of pulling the arm. So to the point of engagement as tight as possible, and that is one way of adjusting the kind of clutch pedal. But there's another part to this as well, and that is the clutch pressure plate and what we call the thrust bearing. So the thrust bearing, what's it doing? So when we push our foot to the floor on the clutch, it will pull the cable in and then pull the arm with it, and obviously the spring is a thing that pulls it back. But as you can see, when we push it, our thrust bearing is also coming forwards. Yeah, we see that movement backwards and forwards. So that thrust bearing, as it moves backwards and forwards, pushes against our pressure plates. So these pressure plates will be this way round, they'll be against the thrust bearing here, and as that thrust bearing pushes forward, it will engage our springs, tongs, I don't know what you want to call them, on the pressure plate and engage the clutch. And there are different pressure plates and different thrust bearings depending on the model of car you've got and the engine you've got. So this is a 500F that we're looking at here, and actually on this particular one we have an interesting piece on the thrust bearing, sorry, not the thrust bearing, the pressure plate, which I've not seen on other 500s, and which I couldn't find online when I was looking, did a brief search earlier, but you can, sorry, just hold that again, you can see that the addition there on that pressure plate, and that would in itself elongate the or actually reduce the kind of pressure you have to apply to the pedal in order for that thrust bearing to engage the springs, and therefore raise the height of the clutch, the clutch bite point. Now, also I remember when I think it was on my 500L, I had to replace the thrust bearing because it had a problem, and I ordered a new thrust bearing and pressure plate and clutch, and for the right model, but the thrust bearing was slightly different in design, and I suspect that's because there's different manufacturers as well, but it wouldn't engage in the way the original thrust bearing engaged. So I had to hunt for one that was similar to the one I had previously, and when I did that, it suddenly worked well. So there seems to be different manufacturers, the thrust bearings and the pressure plates. They should all be the same, but they're clearly not. Slightly different designs, slightly different types, and depending on kind of the thrust bearing and the pressure plate and how much kind of distance there is between those two things, can change the pedal length about where the clutch engages. So if you're having problems with a long pedal, I would be checking first of all the cable. I'd be making sure, as we talked about, that it was secure at the back on the gearbox. I'd be making sure it's nice and tight at this end and well positioned. I'd be making sure my spring here was good first, and if all that was good, then I'd be looking at my pressure plate and my thrust bearing and see whether I could find others that made a difference to that pedal length. It's worth noting here that the N and the D have a very different pressure plate. The pressure plate, as you see from this diagram, is the item in red. The thrust bearing and the arm and the cable, the spring, everything else looks very similar, if not the same, but you can see that the pressure plate is very different in look. So for any of you with a long clutch pedal or problems engaging the clutch, hope that was helpful. If you have any other questions, or I can be of help in any other way, then please let me know in the comments, and hope to see you again soon.